Okay, today is 16 July 2008. We are at Hewlett's Landing, New York, and we're interviewing Mary Minon. Is that?
That's right.
Okay, and Mary, for the record, would you please state your full name, your date and place of birth, please, if you don't mind?
I'm Mary Edith Knight. All of my friends have known me as Molly all my life, so I'll say I'm Molly Knight Minon.
Okay.
And I was born May 16th, 1936 in Whitehall, New York. And
Did you attend school there?
no, because you see, you did mention Hewlett's Landing, and that's really, when I was 3 days old, I came home to Hewlett's Landing.
Okay.
And I grew up in Hewlett's Landing until, of course, 1940s. And then we took apartment in Whitehall. The big thing was in Hewlett's Landing there was a one-room schoolhouse.
Mm-hmm.
So I started my school in a one-room schoolhouse. And then we went to Whitehall. By that time, I was in first grade, although I was a bit young for that, but then I'd started young.
Mm-hmm.
They needed to fill the schoolhouse. So I got a jump start on my education. And so when I got to Whitehall, I was in first grade. And we were renting the second floor of the King residence there on William Street. And we were there because I think the best description would be my mother got tired of winters in Hewlett's. Mm-hmm. So we rented in Whitehall, and Mother said, well, of course, you know, she had to have an excuse for that, so she went to work at the silk mill. And she used to bring home these spindles that every kid in Whitehall used for Barbie dolls, because we dressed them and we played games with them, and I can still remember that was what I was doing that Sunday of Pearl Harbor. I was sitting in the front window, the sun was on this, and I was dressing this silly cone that came home from the silk mill. My mother called us to lunch, and my brothers and I were eating. My father was listening to a football game, and all of a sudden he came into the room and said, the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor. And of course, what was I? 5 and a half, working on 6 maybe, 5 and a half. And I remember saying nothing at all but my jaw hanging open. I'm short full of food. But my brother said, what does that mean? And my father said, war! And left the room. Mm-hmm. The next morning, I went with my mother, by the time the boys were in school, of course, I went with my mother over to the railroad station while my father caught the 8 o'clock train for Albany. And both my brothers and my father were volunteers. My father got there and has told the story many times, so I have to tell it since he's long gone, bless his heart, but he got there and told them that he was a veteran of World War I. And that he was a graduate of Officer Candidate School in Houston, Texas. And he got no further. He told us that what they said was, we don't want to know how old you are, just sign. Mm-hmm. Because, as I understood later, they had no officers. And they had to reach out to the ones from World War I. And they sure didn't want to know he was 48 years old and therefore ineligible to go to war, which he did then. But my experience in Whitehall included the fact that we were very, very much aware of everything that was going on. Mother was a student at heart. Mm-hmm. So listening to the radio and keeping track of it all was a hugely important part of what she did while Pop was overseas, and later on when the boys went to war, as soon as they finished high school, they were off. David was a year older, so Ty had to wait and work until he turned old enough to join.
Mhm.
And when he says he joined in August, it's because that's when he turned 17 and could go. And I can remember Mother keeping very close track. I can remember her telling me where the family was all the time. I can remember being given a dime and walking across the bridge in Whitehall, and the bridge was all open with nothing but grids, and sure I'd lose my dime before I got to go to the movies. And when I got to go to the movies, I was very sorry because they always had the newsreels. And Messerschmitts would come barreling in on the movie. And I knew by that time that my father was overseas. And my brother was overseas. And the Messerschmitts in that newsreel, I took so personally that I'm not prone to histrionics, I don't believe, but I can remember having nightmares. Sure that the ones they were aiming at were my father and my brother.
Mm-hmm.
And of course I was young enough to think that way, you know. Now, walking around the streets of Whitehall, and of course you walk, nobody had cars or anything like that, you walked everywhere. I remembered even as a child that there weren't any men. There just weren't any men on the street. Women and children, young teenagers, but no men. One or two, but they were old.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously old. And some of the ones that were in their 50s and still running businesses, because of course they couldn't volunteer. One of the advantages of this business of keeping track of things, both my mother and father were interested in what was happening around them. And my father, after the war, contacted a friend in Washington and asked him, because at that time they were doing research for the American Legion, asked him to find out like percentages of people who were involved. And the word he got back was the percentage of the population of Whitehall, New York, that went to active service was the highest in the country. There were no men left on the streets of Whitehall.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely astonishing, but true. Probably one of the reasons why Whitehall has that fantastic memorial. They're all on it. Mm-hmm. The interesting thing about it was, of course, there was rationing. We learned to cook with a minimum of sugar and no butter. I can remember hating oleomargarine. So sorry, Ty, but hating oleomargarine with a passion. Because you had to pinch this little red button, which then you turned lard into something that was yellow.
Mm-hmm.
No one in their right mind ever considered it butter.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly never did. I swore off it for life. But the bottom line was rationing went even further than the obvious. Obviously, gas was rationed, but we lived in Hewlett, so we had a little A on our car which said that we could fill our whole tank.
Mm-hmm.
No, we couldn't fill our whole tank, but we could have $2 worth. I don't think it filled the tank or came close, but because we had to travel so much. I remember learning to bake with something called carob, not chocolate,
Mm-hmm.
which was a great disappointment to me, as I was addicted to it even then. I also think that one of the things about rationing leads to my funny story. And I do have a funniest. I was short and all even then, but my feet grew at an enormous rate. And you only got tickets for new shoes on a very strict basis. And I'd outgrown my shoes terribly. Mother did not want me to have stunted feet, so she said, all right, I will use my ration for shoes, and we will get you new shoes for the summer. Well, unfortunately, my mother wanted new shoes for me for the summer a great deal more than I wanted new shoes for the summer. So I would run out the door and run down the road and find the nearest good-sized bush, and I would hide my new shoes under the bush. And I'd go off to meet my friends, and there were a lot of kids my age were here for the summer. Their mothers brought them up here hoping that they wouldn't even remember the war. Unlike my mother, who was keeping very close track. But one night, I couldn't find my shoes. I searched under all the bushes, and I knew better than to go home without them. Those were Mother's shoes, as far as she was concerned. She'd given up her ration stamps for those shoes. Well, eventually, of course, I had to go home, and I was in a great deal of trouble. And Mother sent me out looking for that bush almost daily for a week or two. Finally, even she gave up. We never did. Somewhere along the road here in Hewlett's, there is a moldering pair of leather sandals about this long, but I never found them. But I can remember learning very well that one did not waste, as I did.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you have a victory garden too?
Oh my goodness, yes. Matter of fact, it was, it went from the road to the tree line in front of our house, which is only about a quarter of a mile down the road here. And it had everything in the world. And when Pop came home from the war, he was delighted because he spent the first 2 years doing garden.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was a very normal reaction to getting out of the hole there.
Now, did you also have the blackout curtains on your windows?
Oh yes, and the paint on the headlights of the car, and
Oh, I didn't know about that. They painted the headlights to...
the top of them, so they only showed down. And it was really funny looking. Made the cars look like they were going to sleep. But the most impressive thing about Whitehall during World War II was probably a reflection of what I referred to earlier as having so many of the young men, and most of them would volunteer.
Mm-hmm.
They got out of the high school and immediately volunteered. Some turned 17 while they were still in high school and left. Witness the fact that there are any number of gentlemen who have received their high school diploma from Whitehall School District long after they went to Whitehall School District because they never got it before they volunteered for the service. But the interesting thing in all of this was because of that, the patriotism, which of course was what won the war for the United States, it was all over. But I remember being so moved by it, and we had certain days of the week that we would come with our dimes to buy war stamps, bond stamps. And eventually, if you pasted enough in the book, you got your bond. And we did that regularly, all the while we were in school in Whitehall. And everybody, kids are kids, so there was always one who had enough to buy more stamps that day than the other, and agitated a little bit. I was always very glad that I at least had one. Mm-hmm. I can remember stamping my feet quite hard at my mother one day when she said, well, she just didn't have the dime, and I started not going without my ability to buy a bond stamp. So that was a biggie. It was a biggie every week. I remember being on the way to school. No, it was lunchtime when we heard that the president had The war was not over. But that was pretty cataclysmic as far as everyone was concerned because, quite frankly, he had campaigned, and we were very aware of it, on the basis of don't change horses in the middle of the stream. So that added to childlike anxiety. And I can remember thinking when we heard at noontime that in the April that he had died, I can remember thinking, well then what horse are we going to ride, you know? Interestingly enough, I have to add, and it's all out of sequence, and I'm sorry about
No,
this.
that's fine.
But I told you my mother was a student, and she had a 3x5 linoleum map of Europe. And there were 2 pins in it. One was for my brother Ty, and the other was for my father. My father landed in Africa and eventually in Italy and marched up the Italian boot. My brother, of course, landed in the active area of France. We got the B-mails with an awful lot of black marks in them because anytime anyone made a mistake and mentioned a town or the name of anything, that got blacked out. It was very frustrating for Mother, who had to rely on the word on the radio of troop movements of where she thought my brother or my father was allocated at that time, and move her pins in the map. And this was pinned on the upstairs wall, and I can remember after the radio reports every night, we would go up and adjust the blasted pins. And that brought home to me the actuality of having my family over there. And that impressed me in a way that I never realized was different than anybody else's. When I got to high school, long after World War II, there were kids sitting next to me exactly my age. And they had to have had people involved in the war. But they didn't have a clue. They were learning World War II history. I couldn't believe it. I remember saying to my best girlfriend, well, don't you remember when? She says, no. How could you not know? But there were an awful lot of young people that were so protected. I think the mothers didn't want to talk about it. They were so protected that it didn't exist even though they lived through it. On the contrary, my mother was not a protector. She wanted me to know everything. I don't know whether that was good or bad, but here I am telling you all this stuff, probably because it was good.
Now let me ask you, you mentioned the high percentage of men from Whitehall that went to war. Were there a lot of casualties, a lot that men that didn't come back, didn't make it home?
Everyone was a huge tragedy because Whitehall wasn't all that large. But you can see when you look at the memorials that the stars which mark death in action are much fewer than one would think. We had people at war who came back to the Legion, and years later, of course, as I was an older person, I would hear some stories, and certainly I knew there was no lack of action for the people involved from Whitehall. But what would you say? Maybe we lost 25, which was a lot. But when you consider that the entire town between the ages of 17 and 40 went to war, we were blessed. We were truly blessed. But everyone was a hero. You had to know that. And I think that one of the things that I really am very proud of our little town, it is a small town compared to some towns and cities in New York State or in the nation. We have honored all of those men in a way that is, I believe, perhaps close to unique. We have an immense wall of heroes in our downtown. And it goes all the way from World War I to the Persian Gulf.
Mm-hmm.
And each name is someone who attended Whitehall High School and went to war from Whitehall. And I think that kind of an honor roll is absolutely beautiful. I still go there. My son's name is on the Persian Gulf one. My father's name is on World War I, and both my brothers on World War II. Even though Pop was there in World War II, I don't want to write that long name twice. It's really, I point with pride to Whitehall's contribution to the responsibility of citizenship. And I guess that was what impressed me most. All the kids I went to school with, boys and girls, my age, a little older, a little younger, they were all so very aware of their responsibility to our country.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's what makes me proudest. Whitehall did it. A lot of it.
Let me ask you, you mentioned buying the war stamps. Were there any bond drives that included like celebrities that came to the area or anything like that?
My mother wanted me informed, but she never took me out at night. I wouldn't have found out anyway. There must have been, but I don't think so. We're a small town, very small.
Okay.
Maybe we were doing so well in the schools they didn't need to have a bond drive.
All right. Is there anything else you'd like to add or include in your interview? What did you do after you graduated from high school?
Oh, I was fortunate enough to go to Albany State.
Oh, okay.
Albany State, and that's where I met my husband. He was a Korean veteran.
Uh-huh.
And of course, the Whitehall American Legion was very important in our lives. My husband served there, and I got to know a great number of the veterans that I wouldn't have known because I was a little kid.
Mm-hmm.
You know, David and Ty's little sister never came up on their periscope. So I got to know many of them as veterans, as the storytellers.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, my mother taught me well. I pumped them for the stories. But telling their stories would not be fair. I think you're going to get some good ones, especially out of Whitehall.
Well, we already have, and we hope we will continue to do so. And thank you so much for your interview.
Oh, I appreciate you.